So I'm the paper, as David mentioned, is the truth deadly for life? And I'm going to share screen with a handout which has all the quotes that I want to refer to and just an outline of the suggestion that I'm going to make. And I'm happy to field any questions you have on the way through, expressions of indignation or refutation. There are 4 parts. Basically, I'm approaching this question, which I take it to be one of the fundamental questions of philosophy, if not of human life. Is the truth good or deadly for life? And I'm taking the 2 extreme answers to that question in Nietzsche and Plato. But first, I'm going to have a quick glance at the basis of Enlightenment thought, which would be the main alternative to the answers that Nietzsche and Plato supplies, then an outline of what Nietzsche's response and Plato's response, and then a couple of concluding suggestions. So firstly, Nietzsche and Plato. And you'll be familiar with, for example, Heidegger's suggestion that our tradition begins with Plato and ends with Nietzsche. Sometimes he will say Anaximander or something else, but begins with Plato and ends with Nietzsche. And that's what Nietzsche himself characterizes his own thought as the reversal of Platonism. So, and Nietzsche states, frankly, that the truth is deadly for life, with the qualification that for the person of sufficient intellectual or spiritual strength, the creator of values, it can be fruitful. Whereas Plato clearly argues that the truth is the highest good for life, and the life of philosophy is therefore the best way of life, but it is destructive for society as a whole. So both of their full arguments are obviously extremely complex and nuanced, and I'll try to introduce some of the qualifications as we go, but I think that's the essence. So before discussing their suggestions, the central alternative would be that of the Enlightenment, and I'm going to refer in particular to Bacon and Descartes, who I take to be far more important than the later Enlightenment thinkers, because they lay the foundation for the new notion of nature and a new orientation towards nature, and the notion of natural law in the sense of modern natural science and so forth. So this presents the major alternative to both. And the Enlightenment had to bring about two changes. It had to argue for 2 particular things: that society, or the community, political community, should honor reason or philosophy, whereas Plato only puts that forward ironically in the Republic, for example. And it had to produce a form of philosophy or reason that is useful for the community as a whole, and that is the character of modern natural science. Now, from the beginning, that is from Bacon and Descartes, they did not assert that society or the political community lives in the full light of the truth. Rather, they put themselves forward as the inventor of a method of creating methods. That's just a phrase from Bacon, but the inventor of a new methodology that is an instrument, or, to quote Bacon from the New Organon, a machine or a system for the benefit and use of life as a whole, a foundation of human utility and power. And Bacon also asserts in the same work that philosophy is a system that should be judged of by its works, and can only be judged by its works or its fruits, which are the conveniences of life, which means that not everyone understands the actual science that produces those fruits, which means that the truth or the search for the truth does not become genuinely communal. And I left in a reference to Bacon's New Atlantis, where there's a kind of research institute that only releases certain aspects of the truth to the public. And at the end of Rousseau's first discourse, when he's answering the question, is the advance in the arts and sciences beneficial or not for morality? And he answers, no, it's not beneficial. And he refers to Bacon, Descartes, and Newton, that is the 2 founders of modernity and their first great exemplar, and says that their thought, although true, should be hidden. Right? Okay, so this difficulty about the attempt to build a society that is enlightened, that lives in the light of the truth, also at the same time admits that it doesn't live in the light of the truth, and that reflects an inner tension within Enlightenment thought in its relation between means and ends. So on the one hand, reason or modern science is understood to be an instrument, and in Descartes' phrase, a universal instrument from the Discourse on Method. So reason is an instrument, and the end is human utility, or to use Bacon's articulation, to establish and extend the power and dominion of the human race itself over the universe, or in the familiar claim of Descartes, to make ourselves like masters and possessors of nature. And he has two reasons why we need to master nature. One, the invention of an infinity of artifices to have the goods of the earth without effort. And second, for the conservation of health. So engineering and medicine, basically. Okay. Now, I'm suggesting that these tensions lead to a problem that we actually are experiencing a rather acute sense of at the moment. So the result of that tension between the means and the end is that the ends of life cannot be known to be good, and what is good or bad, noble or base, cannot become an object of knowledge. So our only model of reason is modern natural science, and yet science is not the guide to life. And I just mentioned there's a couple of things that have occurred recently. The arguments about climate change and the continuous invocation of following the science with regards to COVID-19 lockdowns and so on. Now, it doesn't matter what view you have of these two important issues, but in both cases, whatever view you have, there is a problem in that there appears to be a scientific truth that we are not following. So that's some kind of tension or failure within the Enlightenment project. But my further suggestion is that the failure to follow our only intellectual authority is the surface of the problem. The real problem is this, and this is a phrase from Bacon: the empire of man over things depends wholly on the arts and sciences. And that's what we've accomplished following out his instructions. We've radically made our arts and sciences radically more powerful. The problem is that we are beginning to treat, or have for a while, treat human beings as things or objects of that science for the ends that are pre-scientific, and which perhaps I shouldn't have said ignoble, but the conditions of life are safety and utility. They're not the ends, but we're substituting those ends. We are substituting those means as the ends. And I suggest that this is where we're going with the further and further trapping of life within our digital universe as opposed to the actual one. So if any of this has any meaning, and then we need to look to alternatives, and I'm looking in this discussion at the pre-modern alternative in Plato and what is sometimes called the postmodern view in Nietzsche. And since they both do not have an Enlightenment teaching in the sense intended by the early moderns, it means that their mode of writing is far more nuanced and difficult to understand. And so I'm sure that anything I suggest can be contradicted by something in their writings, because they are explicitly always writing on several different levels, intending several different things to be understood by different readers. Okay, so first, Nietzsche. Now, Nietzsche assumes that the tradition since Plato thought that theory, contemplation, is good and leads to good practice. And he wants to overturn that because, as he asserts, there is an antithesis between wisdom and life. And I'll read this quote from his early essay, The Utility and Disadvantage of History for Life. If the teachings of sovereign becoming, of the fluidity of all concepts, types, and species, of the want of all cardinal difference between human being and beast, teachings which I think true but deadly, are flung at the people for one generation more in the currently typical rage for education, no one should be astonished if the people is destroyed by egoistic pettiness and misery, by ossification and selfishness, having first disintegrated and ceased to be a people. Now, one of the things that he is suggesting is that the new thought of, say, Hobbes and Locke and many others of the Enlightenment, that individual selfishness can lead to collective good, that Nietzsche claims that this undermines there being a people, that is, a collective informed by a set of values. But the other thing I took the title for this paper from his assertion that he thinks the teachings of the sovereignty of becoming are A, the result of modern natural science, and B, the truth, but deadly for human life. I also reproduced an articulation of a similar thought from Beyond Good and Evil. And I'll read this first quote from the second section of that work. Sorry, the first section. The will to truth that will yet seduce us to many a risk, that famous truthfulness of which all philosophers so far have spoken with deference. What questions this will to truth has laid before us? What strange, wicked, questionable questions. Indeed, we stopped for a long time before the question about the cause of this will, before we finally stopped before an even more thorough or fundamental question. We asked about the value of this will. Now, he's asserting that the value of the will to truth is at the least ambiguous, because in almost every case it's destructive of life, but it can inform the philosopher who creates values. And in a later section, he says, we are fundamentally inclined to assert that the falsest judgments are the most indispensable, that renouncing false judgments would be a renunciation of life, a denial of life, which is the contrary to, well, it's the complement to the notion that the truth is deadly. That is, that false judgment are indispensable for life. In another work, he uses this expression, art is worth more than the truth for life, to express a similar thought. So, if science is our authority for knowledge, modern natural science, which Nietzsche made attempts to suggest that the latest science of the 19th century was in accord with his thought. Science, in principle, cannot judge of qualities, good and bad, just and unjust, noble and base. And so, therefore, it cannot speak of anything of human significance. The result is that art is worth more than the truth for life. And in this passage, Nietzsche clarifies art, that is deception, including self-deception. And in the Gay Science, section 345, there's a particularly good articulation of his argument that science depends upon a non-scientific conviction or faith, which is a kind of moral conviction, which is denied by by the results of that same science. And I'll read this second quote from the Twilight of the Idols. Judgments of value concerning life, for it or against it, can in the end never be true. They have value only as symptoms. And it's very frequent that he will say that morality has value only as symptoms for understanding the character of the person who possesses that morality. They are not and cannot be true. They are worthy of consideration only as symptoms. In themselves, such judgments are stupidities. One must by all means stretch out one's fingers and make the attempt to grasp the amazing finesse that the value of life cannot be estimated. That is, to put it much more prosaically, no judgment of better or worse in any of these senses but that guide human life has any value in regards to its truth. And another way of putting that is, man gave himself all of his good and evil, which is a remark of Zarathustra. Okay, if everything is natural in the modern sense of nature, as the underlying mathematically measurable object of physics, then reality, that is, the world in which human beings live, is an illusion. And I put down for reference these three aphorisms from Beyond Good and Evil, which I think are a very beautiful expression of this. In aphorism 35, he quotes Voltaire saying that he seeks the truth to do the good. And then, and he mocks that. He says, this is humanitarian and stupid. And he puts his alternative on either side of that. The truth is not good, and that's aphorism 36. And 34, what's good is entirely a fiction, that, our created values and so forth. Okay. So for this reason, philosophy, which used to understand itself in his view as the attempt to comprehend being, philosophy is largely a delusion, because philosophy wants to say what is, but everything is becoming, and there is no being. And his alteration of the understanding of philosophy is expressed by his notion that we are not contemplators of the truth, but the creator of values. So everything is becoming. All human action or greatness depends upon the illusion of eternity, because there is nothing outside of becoming. The highest human type, which he still calls a philosopher, is not a knower, but the creator of values. And in Beyond Good and Evil, he uses this expression that the genuine philosophers are commanders and legislators. They say, thus it shall be. But there's no being. And that's why philosophy is a long tragedy, because it posits what is, although it itself will pass away like everything else. The truth, which is that becoming is sovereign, has value only for the creator of new values, who needs to know the underlying springs of human action in order to master them in the construction of a new age. And I've referred to a couple of aphorisms in Beyond Good and Evil where he makes that suggestion. So my suggestion is that Nietzsche's reversal of the theoretical view, one, is a correct inference from the modern notion identifying truth with modern natural science or physics. But secondly, I suggest it's impossible and exacerbates the nihilism that he is so acute a critic of in modernity. And there's a third problem, and he expresses this frequently himself. If you're going to achieve anything as a human being, and in particular as a philosopher, you must frequently forget the truth or avoid the truth. And he puts this formula, a yes, a no, a straight line, a goal that is a created goal, which means you must ignore all qualifications or things that undercut your self-understanding in order to create anything that is noble. Now, my concern is that the absence of the true goals means that we must be fanatical in the service of our created goal, for which reason has no grounds to criticize. For example, to criticize it on the ground that it leads to inhuman results. And Nietzsche is extremely well aware of any possible critique that I could make, and he, in many places, says that we have to be hard and inhuman and so on. But my suggestion, in Beyond Good and Evil, he says that the worst possible thing could be the coming of what he calls the last man, and thus spoke Zarathustra. That is the democratization and mediocratization of human existence. And I suggest, on the basis of political phenomena of the 20th century, that that's not the worst thing, that there are worse things. And therefore, we need to rethink this formulation. So that's my suggestion about Nietzsche's self-understanding. And I'll try to suggest Plato's. Now, I want to proceed with two expressions of Plato's view, two famous expressions that frequently cited in the best hits and greatest memories of Platonic thought, about the relation between truth and what's good for human life. But what I want to suggest in particular is how narrowly they preserve what is the value of truth for the philosopher, and it's much more ambiguous as to the rest of the political community. So the first is an excerpt from Plato's Apology of Socrates, the only dialogue in which he refers to Socrates, which in some sense implies that it's paradigmatic. And in the Apology, Socrates actually calls himself a paradigmata, a paradigm of the philosopher. And after he's been convicted of not believing in the gods of the city, introducing new gods and corrupting the youth, he gets to propose a penalty. And it was thought by friends of Socrates that if he'd said, I volunteer to go into exile, then he could preserve his life. And he refuses to go into exile or to stay in Athens and keep quiet for the following reasons. And I'll read out this quote. He says, perhaps someone like Crito or Plato might say, Socrates, if you stay silent and keep quiet, won't you be able to go into exile and go on living? This is the hardest thing to persuade some of you about, because if I say that this is to disobey the God, and that's why it's impossible to keep quiet, you will not be persuaded by me on the grounds that I'm being ironic. And that, the meaning of irony is a very particular kind of lying. The only time that Socrates uses the word irony in the works of Plato is in the Rival Lovers, where he comments on someone else speaking, and he says, he spoke very ironically, saying this to one person and that to another. And that's the kind of lying. It means lying in, say, Aristophanes, but in Plato, it means speaking with this bifold intention to different audiences. Now, so that's the first part of his answer. If I say that I can't cease to philosophize openly, because that will be to disobey the God, and that's what he's been claiming, well, appearing to claim in the first part of his defense speech. But the irony of that will be seen through. So, and it is irony. He clearly doesn't have any belief in the gods of the city. So, secondly, if in turn I say that it happens that the greatest good for a human being is this, to make speeches, so not to produce works or the fruit of philosophy as in the moderns, but to make speeches every day about virtue and the other things you hear me conversing about in the examination of myself and everyone else, and that the life not spent in such examination is unworthy of being lived by a human being, you will be still less persuaded by me, by my saying that. But that is how things are, men, as I affirm, but it's not easy to persuade you. So he will be still less persuasive of his audience if he tells them what he thinks is true, which is that philosophy, the search for truth, the truth of the beings, is the highest human good. But what he's done in the speech, and what Plato depicts him doing throughout the dialogues, is allowing himself to be misunderstood in the first way. He makes reference to the gods and so forth. And then there are people willing to take that at face value, which is entirely Plato's intention. But what he thinks and what he articulates very clearly in the second part is that the philosophical life, that is the search for the truth, is the highest human good. But that means it's restricted for people for whom that is their central aim. And I just want to bring that out by reference to the second passage, which comes from the Republic. And I'm sure everyone's very familiar with the image of the cave, the political community as a cave in which we are chained from the neck and ankles facing forwards, watching shadows on a cave wall that are reflected from a light behind a wall where people are carrying statues. And there's a torch inside, but the cave is open to the light all along its entrance. And so the implication is that which is true by nature, or that which is in being, is somehow emanates into our community, but our whole self-understanding is formed by the reflections of artifacts, that is, by the language, laws, gods, etc., that each political community constructs. Okay, I just wanted to bring out two aspects of the development of this image. So first, the other so-called virtues of the soul, that is justice, for example, and so on. Moderation, courage. They are perhaps close to what relates to the body, because although they are not within us before, later they are produced in us by habits and practice. But the virtue of being intelligent, and throughout the dialogues, Socrates speaks of the goal as being phronesis, which is in Aristotle becomes the word for practical intelligence, but it has a broader term for Socrates of just being intelligent. And even Aristotle uses the word in the same way in the beginning of the Metaphysics, being comprehensively intelligent. But the virtue of being intelligent, that is the virtue of what happens to be more divine than anything else, seems never to lose its power, but by its orientation becomes useful and beneficial, or in turn useless and harmful. That is, if you're intelligent, you can use that power to do things that are harmful to yourself and others, or beneficial. But it's the natural virtue. It's the natural virtue, whereas the others are habitual. So secondly, in every city, except for the one constructed in the Republic by Socrates and Glaucon and Adeimantus, whoever becomes a philosopher is fairly or reasonably, doesn't share in the labors of the city. And in the Republic, of course, the philosophers have to rule. One of the dictums of the Republic is that you will only have good rulers when those people rule who don't want to rule. So the people who want to know the truth and don't wish to rule have to be compelled to rule. Whereas those in every other city, because they grow up spontaneously against the will of the regime, cannot justly be made to rule. But the implication is that every philosopher grows up in some respects in tension with the city of which they are a part, because they seek the truth of the principles, the answers to which constitute a city. So every political community is constituted by principles or values or convictions or culture that represent answers to the questions of what is justice, what is noble, and so on. Right, so I take that to imply that Plato has two aspects to his teaching, obviously infinitely more complex and nuanced in the original, but I will try and isolate these two elements as follows. One, the search for the truth is in principle and not accidentally in tension with the political community, precisely as the culmination of the community's aspiration to true principles. Because communities want to have not just an idea of justice, but they want to think it's true. But the philosophy is impelled by the impulse to know, to question that apparent truth. Secondly, the civilized political community would allow for the cultivation of philosophy as the culmination of the sciences. But philosophy, which he calls divine madness in the Phaedrus, divine madness in theory, that is in contemplation, needs to support the conventions in practice. And we saw that in the quote from the Apology, that where he almost explicitly tells you, this is the reason for my rhetoric and why I am half telling you, why I'm giving you this particular falsehood here and why I'm giving you an image of the truth here. Okay, but that's also why, if you look at the Phaedrus, the first half culminates in this discussion of philosophy as, the contemplation of the beings, and it's immediately followed by the problem of the political expression of that, and so a discussion of rhetoric. Okay, so in sum, the truth is beneficial for life, but only one particular way of life. So that's it. I make some suggestions about what ought to be done, and I make these suggestions on my own hypothesis that I think that there are difficulties in adhering to the Nietzschean view that mean that I can't adhere to it. And if that's so, then what could we do in the context of the suggestion that there is something to Plato's thought? And this is what I suggest. So the aspirations to human dignity of modern philosophy, say Mill and Kant, and if you've taught or been a student in a course at a university on ethics, you'll get Mill, Kant, Aristotle, and sometimes you'll get Nietzsche as well, or another more recent thinker. And the intention of Mill and Kant, I think, are noble. Like Mill wants as many people as possible to realize their potential for self-understanding, for learning, for expression, for art, and so on. I think that would be my goal too. But I think that their theory is incoherent. At the foundations. And the reason I think that is because they attempt to model their understanding of reason upon modern natural science, or they attempt to assimilate it to modern natural science, and that doesn't work, I suggest. Happy to be refuted shortly. So I think Plato's philosophy can inform the attempt to restore that nobility, the standards of nobility that the moderns create, through two things. One, a refusal to restrict reason to quantitative measure. And I refer to a couple of passages from the Youth of Pharaoh and the Statesman, where Socrates and the Athenian stranger, the Eleatic stranger in the Statesman, they're having conversations of the following kind. Can't we get answers to questions about number or about measure, the measure of a weight? And the answer, of course, is yes, we can. We can just use the appropriate instrument, consult the appropriate mathematical expert. But what about questions of qualitative questions? What's just, what's noble, what's beautiful, and so on. For that, there is not a measure visible in the same way. But that should not lead us, as it has led us, to say that therefore these measures don't exist, but rather that makes those measures those which we most need to understand, because they guide the enormously powerful quantitative science that we now have. First suggestion. Second, the reinstitution of rigor in intellectual life, which means precisely the recognition of the value of those ways of knowing that reflect the value of art and literature, that was written rapidly, in making visible human excellence. That is, that the qualitative measures of life, those things that exhibit human excellence, can only be given in what we call art or literature. They obviously can't be given in a hypothetico-quantitative mathematical physics. So the focus on the quantitative vulgarizes the qualitative, reinforcing the unrecognized vulgar qualitative ends of quantitative science. That's an incredibly awkward way to say anything. So I'll try and put it into English. So our overemphasis on science, which is an extremely powerful tool, means that we neglect the literary and artistic truths expressible in works that are not studied as much as they should be. And that ends up vulgarizing our understanding of the ends to which we should use our radically new scientific powers. Okay, qualification. If art completes nature, which is an Aristotelian formulation, but which I think Plato would be in agreement with, there is no unmediated access to nature. That is, precisely, we must go through works of art and works of literature to understand, say, human nature. But it also means there's no full enlightenment. Just as it's impossible to do without the notion of nature if we are going to reason about human affairs. And this is Socrates' argument and Plato's argument, that if you want to discuss something such as justice, your disagreement about the fact that there is such a thing as justice, your disagreement about what justice is constitutes a kind of proof that it exists, even if we don't know what it is. But that means that character of justice still remains elusive. There used to be a scholarly tradition when I went through university, suggesting that what Socrates was doing in some dialogues that were wrongly called early dialogues, we have no knowledge of what was written at which point, but was seeking definitions so that then he could apply those definitions of justice to life. It's completely false. What he is showing in each and every case is that our definitions of justice or courage or whatever do not meet the phenomena, are not internally consistent, not consistent with our experience, and therefore the most important thing is philosophy. And I reproduce a little saying of Heraclitus, "Phuse cryptestai pile," which is nature. Yeah, nature. You could translate that. Nature tends to hide itself. Nature loves to hide itself. Okay. Now that I think that's my positive suggestion. Now, I think there's a tendency heading in the opposite direction, which I'm suggesting constitutes a danger. So the conclusion of modern philosophy is that we ought to live in accord with reason, but the understanding of reason we have, the paradigm of it, is modern natural science, which can't inform life, it can only rule it. So modernity, this formulation, exacerbates one of the temptations of reason, an understanding which renders the truth deadly for life, because reason is instrumental to passion or undercuts ordinary existence, and so self-knowledge destroys the end of the passions, that is, life or happiness. And I reproduce a saying from a fragment from Democritus, who had an understanding of reason that did undercut the ordinary human experience. And he said, reason itself is accustomed to take joys from itself. That is, reason can be harmful to life. There's an early fragment of Nietzsche. It's in accord with a lot of things he says, but I thought it would be helpful for the way in which I think the instrumental understanding of reason is a danger. So, such phantoms as the dignity of man, the dignity of work, are the paltry products of a slavery that has concealed itself from itself. And I want to read, I saw this motto in reference to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which I want to read first before I relate the two. Our mission is to create a world where every person has the opportunity to live a healthy, productive life. Now, my suggestion is that that's the perfect formula for someone who wanted slaves. He wanted to be healthy and productive. And that's what Nietzsche means. Like, instead of developing a world where people have leisure to study, to create, and so on, we are, by saying the dignity of work, we are undermining those works that give human life their significance. Right, and so I quoted the passage before, the one in which Nietzsche says that the teachings that he regards as true are deadly for life. And this is the continuation of that passage. He ended that passage by saying that continuing to teach the sovereignty of becoming as we are will destroy and fragment the people. The people destroyed by the truth of the sovereignty of becoming, will then perhaps be replaced in the future, in the arena of the future, by systems of individual egoisms, brotherhoods whose purpose will be the rapacious exploitation of the non-brothers and similar products of vulgar utility. To pave the way for these creations, we only need to write histories from the standpoint of the masses and scrutinize history for those laws that can be derived from the necessities of these masses. That is, for those laws that govern the movement of society's lower strata, its loam and clay. Now, I happen not to share Nietzsche's disdain for the large majority of human beings, but I do find his remark insightful about the rapacious exploitation by the brothers of the non-brothers, so that the apparent democratization of the ends of life leads not to the equal flourishing of all, but to this picture of exploitation. I think that's where his suggestion has a lot of power. And that's actually all I wish to suggest. So I'm happy to begin being refuted or corrected.